truly privileged actually to be here tonight, because I thought, how many people are going to be here? My estimate was between 3 and 5, and I thought, so how can I best entertain you? And I already envisioned, we're going to the imaging center, and the brave of you may take an imaging study real quick. But that's, of course, obviously not happening tonight. So I will give you some ideas of my previous work. I'll give you some ideas where the field stands right now. And I'll give you more ideas where the field hopefully is moving towards in the future. And as Dr. Morali has pointed out, the Royal has made a major investment into imaging technology, which really, I think, elevates the game, the scientific games and the scientific research to a new level. And I'll give you some ideas where hopefully we'll be able to take this. And one last comment before I start the presentation. I think you're all registered, so some of you hopefully, in fact, it was my hope that all of you who are going to be here, and initially I thought it's between 3 and 5, but it's about 200 or something, that all of you will end up in our new imaging equipment. So there will be a long question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Feel free to ask me everything you want to know about this new technology, and I'll give you my answers and my responses as honestly and as good as I can. Now, let's get started. Basically, I have structured the presentation today into 3 segments. The topic of the talk is imaging the traumatized brain, and I already have to deviate from this title, because I also show you when it comes to trauma, to physical trauma, to the central nervous system. I'm not going to show you some images of the brain, but I show you spinal cord injuries and give you some ideas where this field may move towards. But then I will start out also to talk a little bit about PTSD, about post-traumatic stress disorder. And at the end, I want to give you some ideas about some novel treatments and where the field may go towards. And I will dedicate some of this talk also to the topic of cannabis and to the topic of cannabinoids as a potential treatment for PTSD and other mental health conditions. And I'm pretty positive that this will hopefully be of interest, but also will elicit some type of interesting discussions between you and me, and you and me. Anyway, so let's get started. When we talk about trauma, we basically can distinguish between 2 types of trauma. One is the psychological traumatizations, and the other one is physical trauma. And let's start out with the psychological traumatizations, which very often can lead to something that you may already have heard is called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, initially, I think we have to start out with some education. So what is PTSD? What is post-traumatic stress disorder? It is an anxiety disorder, for the simple reason because anxiety symptoms are some of the very important symptoms that we observe in people with PTSD. Then I will try to answer the question, what is a trauma, or what is our scientific definition of a trauma? Then, of course, as you will find in the numbers I'm going to present you, but also ask yourself, who has been exposed to trauma in their lives, and probably, actually, who has been exposed to trauma in your own opinion? Well, I, and most of you, exactly. And that's also reflected in all the science, all the epidemiological studies. Most of us have been exposed during their life to psychological trauma, and only, fortunately, a minority of us develop something what's called post-traumatic stress disorder. So the question is, what is a normal stress response? And I'll try to answer that question. And then what does have to happen that a normal stress response turns into something that we call an abnormal stress response? And what is normal? When you get older, then you ask yourself, what is normal? And especially when you see your own kids growing up. But, or observe yourself, But yes, there's something sometimes called abnormal stress response leading to a diagnosis of PTSD, and usually I try to define abnormal when the symptoms interfere how you want to live your life, when it really becomes a burden for you, and maybe also for your environment, and may require some sort of intervention or treatment. And that is how I would define abnormal. Well, when we go back to the history, PTSD is not a new terminology. It has been in the scientific literature and also in the popular and the lay people literature for a very long time. And we can really distinguish between two major fields of trauma and then symptom associations. One is related to military trauma and the other one is civilian trauma, but the reality is they are very intermixed with each other. And those are just some of the definitions as they emerged in the literature over the years. It's soldier's heart, shell shock, and so on and so forth. Combat-related fatigue, traumatic neurosis, the Coconut Grove nightclub fire during the Vietnam War, of course, we saw a lot of that. And actually, that was really, that brought PTSD to the public awareness, that there's a whole generation of young people who were exposed to the Vietnam War and came back then to the United States, have been traumatized. And the society had to carry the psychological consequences of all of this. And it has been officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association in 1980. So it's a fairly young diagnosis, an official diagnosis. Well, the question is really, so what is a trauma? A trauma is, per definition, if you experience or if you witness or if you're confronted with an event that involves actual or threatened death, serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or of others. Wow. So this is the textbook definition. What really constitutes a trauma to all of us can be very different. So, for example, I had a patient who found her son hanging in a tree after he had committed suicide. Well, strictly speaking, it doesn't meet any of those three criteria, and still the woman developed very severe post-traumatic stress disorder, not surprisingly. Or another example, for example, I had a young man, well, he was actually exposed when he was on the phone with his father who jumped off a roof, and of course was one of the major reasons why he developed PTSD. But as I said, this is a textbook definition, but we really all have to ask ourselves, what constitutes trauma in our life, and not everything is a trauma. So, for example, sometimes people approach us and say, "Oh, you know what? My grandmother had been ill for 20 years, or 10 years, 5 years. She suffered from cancer, and then she passed away, and now I'm traumatized." Well, strictly speaking, and not even if you take the most elastic definition of a trauma, this does not constitute a trauma. This is a very severe situation, personal situation for the affected person, no doubt about that, but this is maybe a grief reaction, maybe an abnormal grief reaction, but that alone does not constitute a trauma, right? So anyway, so this is the official definition of a trauma, but of course, what is also very important to understand when we talk about trauma is what is my personal emotional reaction to the event. And it usually involves fear, helplessness, and horror. So those are three emotional reactions to it, which are fairly common and which are fairly reported by almost everybody who gets exposed to severe trauma, and also is part of the diagnostic assessment of people with trauma-related psychopathology. Well, I think we have answered that question already, that the majority of people experience one or more traumatizations during their life, and these are just some epidemiological studies, not very recent, but the numbers haven't changed really. And what you can see here is that a substantial portion of the general population gets exposed to trauma. But there's one thing that is even more important than these numbers, that people who have experienced trauma, especially early in life trauma, are I call them always magnets for trauma, because they walk from one disaster to the next, and we don't quite understand why this is. But we always have to keep in mind that the single trauma in the life of a person is truly the exception. It's very, very rare that people only get exposed to one trauma in their life, usually, and especially when they start early with a trauma history. Usually, as I said before, they walk from one disaster to the next. And when we talk about the nature of the trauma, so for example, sexual trauma, that's also something that people don't really want to talk about very often. But sexual trauma is a childhood disease, a childhood issue. right? Because it unfortunately very often happens in young children, age 5, 6, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, and the psychological impact on the life of and also on the psychological and emotional development of these affected people is tremendous, and they really have a tendency to make wrong decisions throughout their life. And why this is, we don't quite understand, but it seems to be one of the consequences of the early trauma exposure. So always keep in mind, when we talk about trauma, is a substantial portion is affected by it, but only, fortunately, a very small percentage of people develops post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, what is a so-called normal response to trauma? Rarely people get completely ignorant towards what happens to them. And so an emotional response to the traumatic event is fairly common. And of course, one of the variables how strong your emotional response to it may be or may not be is the intensity of the response varies with the severity of the trauma and the proximity of to the trauma, right? So a trauma that you are personally affected by and that affects you, so when you get sexually abused, has a higher impact, for example, than when you hear about it. Or if you had been, like we observed it quite substantially and quite profoundly actually after 9/11, you know, when the World Trade Center was destroyed, that people who have been in the vicinity or really in the buildings and survived physically very often had post-traumatic stress disorder after the event, but also, you know, entire America, almost the entire world was affected alone by hearing about it. But of course, you know, the severity of the trauma response was quite different in those who were affected versus those who only heard about it. Then very important is what are the re-experiencing symptoms. So people who had a severe trauma exposure revisit their trauma all over day and night, sadly. In their thoughts, in their dreams, images, they come back. So those are one of the key symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Then, of course, a very emotional response to it, which involves fear, anxiety, anger, helplessness, and despair. And something quite interesting is the fact that, for example, the anxiety response and the fear response is very profound early on after the trauma, and then often tapers down and gets replaced more by despair and depression. And so one of the big misconceptualizations right now, for example, amongst the military personnel is that, for example, in the Afghanistan-Iraq wars, or anything what happens in the Middle East, that people think only now, based on the fact that the combat operations get down and you know, the soldiers don't get exposed to these traumatizations anymore so profoundly as they had been initially in multiple combat operations. Now everything will get better. Well, that's wrong. Things will not get better, but only the initial anxiety response, which is often kind of driving people to see and to seek help, gets replaced by depression, which then is linked to suicidality. So if we don't do anything and if we don't come up with novel treatments for these people, the suicide rate will probably continue to rise until we have more effective treatments than what we have currently. Well, then these people are always on high alert. No wonder, right? Because they always seek out every danger that can happen, even in the safest of all situations. And so this hypervigilance, for example, is also one of the key symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, you know, when we talk about autonomic arousal, that basically means, you know, the heart rate is up, you know, they're sweating easily and so on. So they're constantly, you know, hyperactive, basically, their vegetative nervous system. And then, of course, the persistent memory to the event in all their alterations with time. And then, of course, this does not distinguish a person who will develop PTSD down the road. And usually those symptoms remit over weeks and months after the traumatic event, but in a small percentage of people, they just remain. And that's basically how we again define PTSD and the course after the trauma exposure. So weeks and months, a few months after the trauma, we talk about an acute stress disorder, which is quite normal. But then we talk about acute PTSD if the symptoms kind of continue to exist. 1 to 3 months or so, and then if they exist and continue to exist beyond this time point, then basically we talk about chronic PTSD. And one thing also you should keep in mind, the absence of an acute trauma response immediately after the trauma does not mean that you won't at risk later on to develop PTSD. It takes some times, months and even years, to develop kind of your emotional response, or at least to start talking about your emotional response after the traumatic event. And you may have heard, some of these reports, when women, for example, start talking about their sexual abuse decades later. And people say, why is she talking now about it 15 years later? I mean, why didn't she open her mouth when this really happened? Well, because she couldn't. It's not that she didn't want to, but she simply couldn't talk about it. And I think here we really have to be aware that PTSD does not necessarily has to be something that develops immediately after the trauma, but it can really take months and years to become apparent. Well, so what is the problem as clinicians, and actually it's all of our problem. So what is really the problem? The problem is that we start to understand and we start to recognize that exposure to trauma is something that almost affects everybody of us. In fact, when we do our studies and when we recruit people, and then I meet sometimes, really occasionally, I meet people who have no trauma exposure. And I always ask myself, what's wrong with these people? Because what kind of life do they live which is so safe that they really experience nothing in their lives? Well, but they exist, rarely. But anyway, so always be aware, the exposure to trauma and the prevalence of trauma exposure is really high. Then we also have to recognize there's a stigma going with it. So there are some more accepted trauma histories, but there are trauma histories that we really don't want to talk about, such as, for example, sexual abuse. Nobody wants to talk about it. Neither the patients or neither the people who are affected by the trauma event. But interestingly enough, it's easier to sell sometimes military-related trauma rather than sexual-related trauma, because it's kind of a topic that we really kind of want to often keep under the blanket, and that's why I like to talk about it, because I think it's a very important topic. So stigma is a big problem still. On the other hand, when you go to your physicians, for example, I wonder how often you have been asked by them if you ever had a trauma exposure. Probably not that often, right? But it's really important to ask proactively, because you will probably not start talking about it unless you have a really very good and close relationship to your clinician. But I think it's very important to teach clinicians to ask proactively these questions. Have you been exposed to this and that event, right? And if you say yes, and if you describe your psychological reaction to it, then the diagnosis is not that difficult, right? But we have one problem, that we can make a diagnosis, but then we cannot treat it. So we have some tools to treat it, we have some medications to treat it, and we have some psychological interventions to treat it, but really there's room for improvement, as I like to call it, right? Because these treatments are really not such that we can lean back and say, well, this issue is resolved, and that's exactly some of it, what I would like to talk about it. So treatment development is not satisfactory right now, neither for people with psychological trauma, but also not for people with traumatic brain injury or other traumatic injuries of the central nervous system. So what would be the ideal solution? And again, this is work in progress. We're definitely not there. We are probably 10, 15 years, no, maybe a little bit earlier, but we're definitely not there yet. So the solution would be that experienced clinicians kind of diagnose people with trauma histories. They use diagnostic tools, so we have biomarkers that really help us make a diagnosis of, for example, PTSD or also traumatic brain injury, and that these diagnostic tools then help us to select the treatments, and there will be a treatment tailored for you personally, right? So that's like in cancer, right? Cancer 15 years ago, you know, we had 2 or 3 or 4 treatments for all the groups of cancers that there exist. And you got those, and your survival chance was fairly not that great, to be honest, right? Today, you know, we can nail down the genetic signature of your cancer, and your treatment will be tailored towards that. And so in psychiatry, we're unfortunately 15 years behind of that, but we're trying to catch up, and that's really the goal, to develop and to tailor the treatment based on what you went through. And so what we call personalized treatments. And this is really, unfortunately, not yet the reality these days. But I will give you some ideas where we hopefully will be in the very near future. Well, you have seen this building because you walked in. And when you keep walking on the 2nd floor, then you will find a place called the Brain Imaging Center. And so that's the brand new imaging center that the Institute of Mental Health Research has made a major investment into, namely into this. This is a whole body scanner. It's not only a brain scanner, it really can scan your entire body. So you will see where you can get a comfortable seat right on the table, and then we move you into the scanner and we do all the nice things that I will show you in a minute. And as I said before, you know, it's my dedication that all of you end up there, right? So feel free to take advantage of this, because whatever happens in there is free of charge when it comes to you, because it's all going to be research related. So, and if you're really lucky, then you get even paid for it. So, but I mean, I don't want to make too much of advertisement, but this is really the next generation of neuroimaging and of whole body imaging. And this is really where we want to take our scientific enterprises to. Well, now I have to give you a very brief crash course in terms of what we are really doing. So you see our brain imaging machine, and then you take your seat there, and then very often we will inject a radiotracer, which is a small amount of a radioactive substance into you. And definitely not dangerous. I can 150% certify that. And we can have an open discussion about it after. But for now, try to believe me, this is not dangerous at all. And so we inject this radiotracer into you, and then we do some mathematical modeling, and then basically we're looking for 2 things in your brain in this case. So this is a brain image. We're looking basically how is this tracer distributed in your brain, which is called the volume of distribution, which is called the delivery of the tracer. But then what we're really interested in is we are going to study the neurochemistry of your brain. So we really want to see how is your brain working. And we take movies over a period of 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, it depends, and get a very thorough understanding of how your brain really works. Well, the brain is not the only organ we are majorly interested in. Next door, as you may know, some of you have been there, is the Heart Institute, right? And what we also know is that psychiatric illnesses in a very important way affect the heart. So for example, people with post-traumatic stress disorder have a higher risk to die 10, 15 years early, I would say too early, because they develop heart disease which may be directly related to the psychological trauma that they were exposed to. And while we can beautifully document how these people die earlier, we don't quite understand, actually we don't understand at all, why this is and what we can do to prevent it to happen. And this is another major research endeavor that we are going to engage in, which is to study the heart of those people who have been not only been exposed to trauma, but also suffer from depression, anxiety, and other neuropsychiatric indications. So we can not only study the brain, we will also study other organs of the body. And then we take the whole game to the next level, and really have to apologize. You know, when I sent this, when I sent in my slides for tonight, they said, "Oh my God, you cannot show these slides; too difficult." Well, I'll try to kind of deconstruct what I'm showing here. So what we want to do is we want to study simultaneously the function of your brain, while we let you play computer games, for example, while your brain scanned. And so then what we can see is the circuitry, how different areas in your brain activate, deactivate. So basically we study the communication of different brain regions. And that is probably the root why you develop anxiety, why you develop depression, why you cannot focus anymore, and so on and so forth. So we want to understand the circuitry, understanding that different brain regions always talk to each other. So that's the fMRI part. And then we also simultaneously want to understand, the neurochemistry behind. Is it the serotonin system that's dysfunctional? Is it noradrenaline? Or is it maybe cannabis? Or is it the opioids that are kind of not working properly? So all these questions we will going to answer using this technology. So just ignore all the text that's there, and really take as a taking home message. The brain works. It's like a marriage. So if you don't talk to your partner, if you don't talk to your kids, then there will be a problem over time, right? Because you will start fighting. You don't understand each other, and that's with the brain. It's the same thing. If these brain regions don't talk properly to each other, well, someday you will wake up and you will be depressed, right? And then we have to fix this problem using either medications or psychotherapy or both. And that's basically how we approach this, using this technology to make a difference. Oh, and then one of the messages I also wanted to give you, so this is from my time in the United States. I was somewhere on the East Coast. But of course, we did national recruitment. What does that really mean? That means, you may have relatives not in Ontario, well, so I'm new to Canada. Don't quiz me now about the different parts of Canada, but you may have family in Vancouver, right? And they may not be able to do what we are able to do. So feel free to tell them about us, because there will be ways, and there are ways to come from Vancouver to Ottawa and to participate in our research. And so that's why I'm showing this. When I did my studies in the United States, we recruited people from all over the country. And we intend to do the very same thing here. So just spread the message. Okay. Now, I promised you two bigger areas. One is the physical trauma and how we can use imaging to make a difference. And then the psychological trauma. And when I talk then about the psychological trauma, I'll also talk a little bit about cannabis. All right, so how many of you have taken an SSRI in their lives? Okay, well, so this is exactly what happens when you take an SSRI. So the SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are still very important medications to treat depression, right? And one of the mechanisms of action, how these medications work and why they work as antidepressants, is because they block the serotonin transport. And so this is basically what we can show with neuroimaging. In the top row, you see the MRI. That's basically a picture of the structure of your brain. And then in the middle row, you see the serotonin transporter, which is this important molecule in your brain that regulates how much serotonin is available. And serotonin is basically important how you sleep, how you feel, how aggressive you are, and so on and so forth, how your mood is. And so this is basically a healthy person before taking anything. And then you see when you take an SSRI, you basically knock those transporters out, so you block them. And then you make them disappear from the PET image, the positron emission tomography image. And basically it is as if you switch off the lights, right? And this lasts for about 48 hours. If you take Prozac, it lasts a few days longer. But basically that is how we can demonstrate that you really took your medications, right? So we scan you before and then we scan you after. So that's one way how we can use a serotonin transporter scan. But it's also a very interesting tool, and I'm not going now to talk, when I talk about the physical impact of trauma, I'm not going to talk about the brain, but I'm talking about the spinal cord. And for the simple reason, because spinal cord injury is really a very important problem and has very profound effects on the person who is affected, because you can up to paralysis if it's really going through. And one way to look at these injuries is using imaging, as I just showed you before. And so I show you not people, but I show you some animal scans, right? So you see in the controls scan panel, you see the brain, in the top part, and then you see this little kind of thin line, and that is the spinal cord, right? And if you inject a radio tracer, then you can make this visible very beautifully, right? And then on the other side, you see the blocking scan, which is when you take your SSRI and you turn off the switch, and suddenly it's gone, right? Simply because this is, so in the spinal cord, we have a lot of the serotonin transporter molecules. Now, you see the different areas, you see in the cervical part of the spine, and then the lumbar part of the spine, basically a little further down. And then what we can also do is, you see on the left side again the control red is basically, you see the brain up there, and then you see the beautiful nice image of the spinal cord. But then when we do a lesion, and that can happen after, in humans for example, after a car accident, after a sports injury or whatever, then you see suddenly that there's an interruption. This is where the lesion happened. And suddenly you see as if in this little part, in this little portion of the spinal cord, it's gone, right? And so it's very important to make a very precise localization of this injury, and imaging is a very important tool in this process to really help us tailor the treatment, whether it's medication treatment, physiotherapy, and whatever happens after in therapeutic process, really very precisely towards the area where the injury happens. And while I show you this in rats, you can do the very same thing in humans. It's just the field is not quite there yet. So sometimes you can do in animals what you can't do in people. But hopefully in the future we will be able to do that. But why do I show you that? For the very simple reasons, because when I went to medical school, for example, we always learned, whenever something has happened to the brain, it's over. There's no way to repair anything. Well, fortunately, that's not true. So in the past 20 years or so, there have been very important advances in medicine and also in our understanding of how the brain and the central nervous system works. And one of the key ingredients, the salt in the soup, so to say, are the neurotrophins. So those are basically, those of you who are gardeners, you sometimes put the fertilizer into the water and suddenly, the flowers start blooming. Well, those are the neurotrophins for your brain, right? So they are there, and they promote survival, and they prevent cell death. Cell death happens all the time, from when you're a baby to when you're very old. The question is, how does the survival look like, right? And how can you promote new cell growth? And this is really where the neurotrophins come into the game, because they counteract basically the decline of brain function. And they counteract it when there happened, for example, an injury to your brain or an insult to your brain. And it can be a physical insult, but it can also be a psychological insult. And what they really do is that they're kind of boosters of brain function. And I just singled out BDNF for two reasons. Number one is BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And the simple reason is it's an important one, no doubt. But we also have some interest in developing radioligands, these PET ligands, that we can inject and then measure how BDNF works in your body, in your brain, and in your body. And this hopefully, if we can get this project funded, then this should really be a very major step forward. So what does this BDNF really do? Well, it's like a power. It's like a transmission in a power engine. That's what I wanted to say. It's a power engine of your brain. And what it really does when you activate this BDNF TrkB system, then it really boosts brain function. And this is really one of the therapeutic principles that we are hopefully be able to engage in the very near future. And what really happens then is that, for example, when you look at traumatic brain injury, or when you look at people with depression, schizophrenia, alcohol abuse, all the variety of all these neuropsychiatric indications, they have one thing in common: the brain shrinks, right? And so we try then, by using these neurotrophins, kind of to counteract that, by basically working with the structural plasticity of the brain, because the brain does not only have the potential to shrink, it has also the potential to grow. And this is really what we want to take advantage of. So basically, we want to induce and help the brain and the body to kind of counteract the effects of aging, counteract the effects of physical and psychological trauma. And as you can see on the left side here, on the right side from your angle, this has a very important implication for a whole variety of different indications, starting with Alzheimer's, Parkinson, depression, anxiety, TBI, traumatic brain injury. So this is a very important process and a very simple principle, really. So simple that obviously we didn't really look careful enough, but I hope that we will be able to make a difference there in the very near future. And for example, antidepressants, which some of you may have taken during your life, also, besides working on the serotonin system, but they also increase BDNF levels, as we know. And so all these different medications on the top and also on the bottom, the older antidepressants, they all kind of boost BDNF levels. And so that might be the real true antidepressant effect, because as you may know, it takes a few weeks until an antidepressant works, and we never really understood why, because the effect on serotonin, for example, happens after the first dose. It's just you don't feel better after the first dose. It takes you weeks to months. And one of the reasons might be that maybe serotonin is important but not that critical, and other things might be more critical, and one of them could be, for example, these neurotrophic factors. Anyway, so I want to leave. Oh, and exercise, non-medication. Let's talk about non-medication. Very important, right? So research really has shown that exercising into older age is really, really important for many, many reasons. And one important reason is that exercise and increased exercise is directly related how well established these neurotrophins can work in your brain. And so it really pays off. And exercise is not only good for your physics, but it's also very good for your emotional state, as we also all know. Okay. Now, are you still kind of awake? That helps, because the better part comes always to the end. Well, so of course, you sometimes, when you give a presentation like this, you need something catchy, because, as I said, otherwise people walk away. And cannabis is one topic that usually people are quite interested in. And I cannot, actually this cannabis discussion is quite interesting for the simple reason, because it's very prevalent in the media and everybody has an opinion about it. And what's also in everybody, the lay people have an opinion about it, the politicians have an opinion about it, and the scientists have opinions about it. But the scientific evidence, on the other hand, is actually there's not that much out there yet, right? But it's definitely a system that has quite some promise, and I thought I'd throw it in here because you might be interested. Well, when we talk about the cannabis system, we usually talk about, you may think primarily about marijuana, about pot, and about smoking pot, and then you remember how you did it and how you liked it or did not like it. And but always keep in mind there's an endogenous cannabis system too. So all of us produce cannabinoids all the time. And this is a system that's quite interesting for the simple reason that the receptors that mediate all the actions of the endogenous cannabinoids are located in brain regions which are very important for our emotional well-being. And so, for example, they sit in the amygdala. You may have heard this brain region, which is kind of the emotion center of the brain. It sits in the hippocampus, the memory center of your brain. It sits in the prefrontal cortex. That's the brain area that helps you to make the proper decisions, or sometimes improper decisions. And all these regions, they always talk to each other. As I said before, remember the marriage comment, right? So if you don't talk, then you get in trouble, as you know. And so the CB1 receptor that mediates the actions of the cannabinoids sit in high concentrations in these brain regions, and that's why we are so interested in this. But we are also interested, actually, when I started thinking about the cannabinoids, I thought about it based on two facts. One is that in most of the scientific studies we did, when we did neuroimaging or any other interventions, drug users were always excluded. And when I was thinking of the PTSD populations, the trauma populations, they all smoke pot, right? And so they could never participate in our studies because drug use was always an exclusion criterion. And then when you talk to them, they say, well, it works better than anything that we have legally available. Well, let's leave it at that for now. So what are the endocannabinoids really doing? So the endocannabinoids, they are similar to the neurotrophins. They're kind of regulators of transmitter release. So they basically tell you how fast or slow the brain should be driving, right? Because they regulate how much serotonin is released, how much noradrenaline is released, and so on, and other neurotransmitter systems. And so they are basically in the driver's seat in your brain. And as you can imagine, when the brain develops or when there happens something to you that affects your brain, that could have a very profound impact on the driver's seat. Just think you have a car accident and somebody crashes into the driver's seat. That's not good. You will probably not be able to continue driving. And that's happened here too, you know. If something happens to endocannabinoid function in your brain, it will have a very profound effect on brain function in general. And if we believe that brain function has something to do with behavior, and I honestly believe that, then it will change behaviors. And I'll show you how. And again, animal studies are quite useful in this context, because when we look at the at chronic stress effects, for example, then we see that anandamide, which is the abbreviation is AEA, which is one of those endogenous cannabinoids, so one of these substances that your body is producing all the time, it basically is reduced. And FAH, I apologize for these all these little letters, but FAH is basically the enzyme that regulates how much anandamide you have. And FAH is upregulated, so it works really, really hard, with the result that under chronic stress conditions, your endocannabinoids go down. And then there's an interesting parallel, because in PTSD populations, for example, which are by definition a chronic stress disorder, we also found that the endocannabinoids are low. And in healthy people, and then in people who had a trauma history but did not develop PTSD, it's actually fairly normally high. So basically we could replicate what happened in the animals, we could replicate in people. That's always a good sign, because it doesn't happen too often in science. Right? But we can do a little bit better, because we were also looking then, taking these movies of the brain, bringing you back to the imaging center that we have. And we could show for the first time that when your function of the cannabinoid system goes down, then your brain starts to restructure itself. And one of the attempts to restructure itself is that the CB1 receptor, which is this very important, this cannabinoid type 1 receptor, which mediates the actions of the endocannabinoids, kind of tries to take better use of the lower amount of cannabinoids that are available and upregulate, so its number is increasing. And this is basically what you see here. So in the PTSD brain, for example, you know, when the color goes yellow and red, that means there's higher concentrations of this protein available compared to the trauma controls in the middle, and then the healthy controls on the right side. So when it's blue and green, everything is relaxed and calm, and red and yellow is really kind of high activity. And so that CB1 receptor goes up in its concentration in the brain in these people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And actually, it's not a small change. You know, what you see here on those bars is basically, this is a big change. It's a huge change, in fact. And you see the black bars are the people with PTSD, and there you see different brain regions. But anyway, so these are just different brain regions, these different couple bars. And what you see, the black bar basically shows the higher, so it shows basically that in PTSD, the CB1 receptor is much higher than in the blue bar. And the blue bar are the people who had been trauma exposure but did not develop PTSD. So the simple fact, for example, that you have a trauma exposure in your life already changes how your brain functions, and that's very good evidence for that. And then there's also one very interesting example, which is the women in the room can be proud, but they already were born most likely with higher CB1 receptors. And we found this very consistently in healthy people, but also in patient populations, that women have higher concentrations and higher levels of this CB1 receptor than men. And this seems to be really a kind of a constitutional thing. But importantly, this is not only important to make a diagnosis, but it's also important to understand, for example, anxiety, because this higher CB1 receptor is related to your expression of fear and anxiety. And the higher this receptor is, for example, in the amygdala, the higher your anxiety is going to be. And that brings me back now that it is very important because sometimes, for example, people with PTSD, and when I met them, the trauma and the effects of the trauma become so normal to them that they don't even realize that how different their life really is and how different they behave. And they say, well, but I was told this is a psychosomatic thing and it's just psychological and it's not real. I said, well, trust me, it is real. And when you show them then, for example, a slide like this, where you can say this is how your brain looks like and this is the brain how it should look like, so you tell me there's some difference, right? And if the person also feels different, this often has been a high motivator for them to seek treatment. And I think it's really important to understand, whatever happens has an impact of how your brain functions, how your body functions. And there are differences where neuroimaging, for example, can make them visible, and you can put them into a picture like this. And it's very important for people to understand that. But this is not written in stone based on the fact what I told you before, that this is, that the brain is a very plastic organ. So it can change, and that's the purpose of the treatment. So when we talk about the CB1 receptor, so this middle part of the slide basically shows you the range, the so-called normal range of CB1 receptors. So there are some important things to learn from all these studies that we and other people did. One is women, as I told you before, and I showed you the bars, women already are born most likely with higher levels of the CB1 receptor than men. Then with age, for example, your CB1 receptors will go down. But interestingly enough, also trauma exposure alone, without even developing any symptoms, will push your CB1 receptors up. And so then, I was never great in math, but one thing I understood, trauma exposure times being a woman is probably a very risky situation. And that's something that we know, again, from the literature very well, that women after trauma exposure have a higher risk to develop PTSD compared to men, independent from the trauma history. And so this could be one of the contributing factors why this is, because they have a genetic risk, and then the environmental factor, trauma, for example, or life history factor comes into play and pushes them over the edge. And when you get over a certain threshold of CB1 receptors in terms of increase, then you can develop something what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, and has very interesting symptoms, as I showed you before, which are related to anxiety, irritability, sleep problems, flashbacks, all the symptoms of PTSD. And then something interesting happened, what I also mentioned before. These people don't respond to the usual treatments or get no treatment whatsoever, and then try cannabis, right? Try to smoke pot, for example. And suddenly some of them start to report, well, I feel so much better, right? And one thing why they may feel better is the CB1 modulation. So basically that once you start smoking pot, you downregulate your receptor. And you may bring it back to a normal level, but then there's one small problem built in, which is some people just can't stop, right? And if the CB1 receptor is in free fall, then basically, and that's what we find in many of the chronic cannabis users, and especially in those who we call being addicted, because they have addiction symptoms, they have the same symptoms, interestingly, as they started out with. They have sleep problems, irritability, mood swings, and so on and so forth. So this is all not a very trivial problem, and we don't understand it very well at this point, but still, it's a mixed bag, and we try to, hopefully over the next coming years, try to open this box and really find a scientific solution to the problem. Because there might be a few approaches, and I just present you two. One, so in terms of treatment, what I wrote here, CB modulation. So having a high CB1 receptor is probably not a good thing, because it's one of the characteristics of PTSD, for example, but also of alcohol use or of anorexia. So we did different patient populations, all a very uniform picture. So bringing this receptor down to the normal level might be a good thing. One approach could be, for example, these fatty acid amide hydrolase inhibitors, FAH, right? You remember in the chronic animals, this FAH was upregulated. It means it was working too hard, and therefore bringing down the endogenous cannabinoids. So if you block this enzyme, maybe that's one approach to do something better. And then, of course, we have the quiz question, which every of you can answer correctly. What is this? Yes, that's the cannabis plant, right? So, so you see this is really a full one, very pretty, very beautiful. And you see this little, it's like as if rain has fallen. So this is all full of cannabis, so this is, that's the beauty of it. And so, of course, the cannabis growers, they're getting ready, because they smell the big money. And, the plants are still small, but trust me, they're growing. This is a whole science. I consulted for a cannabis company in the past 2 years or so, and cannabis growing company, and growing cannabis is not a trivial task. So it's not something you do on your balcony. This is medical quality cannabis and has its own regulation, has its own quality control, and so on and so forth. This is a real business, and they take very well care of their plants, as you can imagine. And this business is just now starting up, but it will most likely be growing. Okay, but so what I have to conclude at this point is, that when we talk about the cannabinoids and when we talk about cannabis as a potential treatment for PTSD and other mental health conditions, there's a lot of evidence that this could make sense. It's probably the most promising approach could be to modulate the system in its entirety. So basically to modulate, either the metabolism or substitute some of the cannabis with exogenous cannabis, or maybe work with the endogenous resources. We don't quite know the approach yet, but this is some of the questions we will have to find answers. What I really want to point out, because as I said before, this is a very intense and often emotional debate, and everybody has an opinion, and some of you will voice theirs, hopefully. But we do not yet have the clinical trials that really support the use of cannabis in any indication. But this is definitely something that the scientific field has to catch up and has to do in the years to come. And I think one advice is just to take the emotions out of the discussion, right, and let the data speak. And then hopefully we will be able to answer in the near future whether using cannabis is a meaningful and really good approach to treat PTSD and other mental health conditions. And I say thank you. This is my email. You find it also on the card if you want to email. And as I said, those who take the card, please don't call me. Not that I don't want to talk to you, but don't call me out of the blue. Just email me, and we can always set up an appointment. So thank you again, and let's open this up for discussion.